Welcome to the Insightful Investor Podcast, a weekly series that seeks to share industry, investment, and market insights. Learn more about our show at insightfulinvestor.org. We're starting the new year with a brief detour from our usual conversations, exploring Hollywood with an extraordinary guest. I'm excited to welcome Jim Gianopulos, one of Hollywood's most influential leaders. Jim is the former chairman and CEO of both 20th Century Fox and Paramount Pictures, and has overseen a broad range of hugely successful films over his many decades in the industry, including shepherding Titanic, Avatar, and Top Gun: Maverick, three of the biggest films of all time and three of my personal favorites. He's a visionary who helped bridge Hollywood and Silicon Valley and driving innovation while honoring storytelling. We'll explore his journey, insights on leadership, and the future of film. Jim, I've been looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Alex. It's great to be here. Great to be with you.
Well, let's start with your path from lawyer to chairman and CEO. Would you walk us through that?
Yeah, I guess the short answer is I worked my ass off in between lucky breaks. And, luck is always a part of one's evolution. But I always had a passion for film. Actually, my parents are Greek immigrants, and my grandfather used to take me, even as a kid, 5 and 6 years old, used to take me to movies, mainly to spend time with me, but also to translate for him because his English wasn't that great. And as a result, I ended up seeing things I had absolutely no business seeing as an 8 and 10-year-old. But it started a love affair with film that lasted all my life. So I was interested in finding a way in. I was also interested in music. I played in bands, but I realized I was never going to be the guitarist for the Rolling Stones. So maybe I could be their lawyer. So I went to law school, and I came out and I went into the music business. And then they invented this thing called video. And that was the first lucky break. I got a job as the third employee of a joint venture between RCA and Columbia Pictures, which ended up, of course, being hundreds of people eventually and an industry that was hundreds of billions of dollars. And I was there at the beginning. So that was a great opportunity. And eventually we were buying films and setting up businesses all over the world and financing films. And I became very fluent on the international side of the business. And so found my way into Fox and eventually worked my way up the food chain. I was running all the international operations and then was named first co-chairman and then eventually chairman. So it was a great ride. And it really was that. It was having great mentors, great role models, and some great opportunities along the way and taking my best shot to earn them.
If you had to distill it down to a few key ingredients in terms of your ability to work your way up all the way to the top, how would you describe that?
Well, when I talk to young people looking to, enter the industry or wondering about their careers, I always say that, the first thing to do is do the job you're doing as well as it can possibly be done. And if that's extra hours or extra effort or extra inputs from other people, figure that out. And then always leave time for your next position, your next opportunity. And whether that's, additional education or reaching out to people who are in the industry. Hey, can I have 5 minutes of your time? People in positions of importance, whether they're talent or business people, often don't mind sharing and talking about themselves. And so, a lot of it is drawing on others' experiences, drawing on watching where industries are going and what might be your next best shot. And all of that's part of networking and, staying in touch with trends and, figuring out how do you get to the next step from here. And in some cases, I also tell them that, don't always be in a rush. Sometimes that opportunity takes a while to come and just focus on being highly regarded in the work you're doing. So I try to follow that. I didn't realize I was following it, but I kind of did. And so it sort of worked out.
Are there any key experiences or any insights that shaped your approach to leadership in the entertainment industry?
Well, it's hard to look back on 40 years and find out, that one moment. I do think that there were people. One of them's one of my closest friends now, Peter Chernin, who ran a news corporation for a while when I went to Fox, and somehow he became supportive and a mentor, and opened up doors for me. Gave me a number of promotions along the road to the chair. Apart from being obliged for his support and his mentorship, I admired him, and I still do hold him as a role model for leadership. I watched how he treated people. I watched how he challenged them. I watched how he dealt with when they fucked up. I watched how he encouraged them, to accept a disappointment and move on. I watched him figure out how to get the most out of all the people he had and make changes where he needed to. So he was a big influence on my career at an early stage and even throughout. And then when he left News Corporation, I said, well, great. Now I don't have to kiss your ass. We can just be friends. And so since then, over 10 years now, 15 years now, we've been very close. And so, those are moments and those are opportunities and intersection of molecules that, you don't forget. You realize we're instrumental in helping you get to the place you are.
But it seems like you also have to be looking for those opportunities because I'm sure many have those opportunities come and go and they don't latch onto them and get the benefit that you just described.
Yeah. And look, I was always looking for ways to improve. I was fortunate. There were times when I put my hand up but not many. I was fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time. And I think I also have to acknowledge that part of that right place was being at a time when the industry was evolving into new media. So when you're the third guy that's at a major studio distributing video around the world, a business that barely exists and is about to be a vertical growth line, you're on the inside track of developing both its business models, the manner of marketing and distributing and financing and all the aspects of that. And I'm not saying it doesn't take work or some measure of intelligence, but it's kind of easy to be a hero at that point. And so, I happened to be there when global television evolved from a few local stations, government stations, to privatized television when there were 10 networks in each country around the world, or when pay television here, driven by technology, which we can talk about later, but enabled people to have an enormous variety of choices and a huge business growth. And then, of course, I was on the international side when that entire industry exploded theatrically and in television and multiple media. So some of it were the opportunities came in part because I was there when those businesses grew and I was in the middle of it. So I had those great opportunities to be part of that.
What were the most challenging strategic decisions you faced while trying to revitalize major studios like Fox and Paramount?
They're different. I mean, at Fox, had been there for several years working with some very talented colleagues. And we were doing pretty well and Peter moved up and my then prior boss moved over. And so when I took over Fox, initially as co-chair, but when I took over Fox, most of the team there were well established and they were colleagues and friends and people that I liked and respected. And so there weren't a lot of changes. It was really building on and innovating and improving on the strategies we already had in place. Paramount is a little different, but in both cases, it starts with people. And I know that's a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason because it's true. Ultimately, these studios are not, one genius at the top. There are thousands of people who make contributions every day to their outcomes. And a lot of it is about, finding the best, keeping the best, and encouraging them all. As I said, at Fox, that was a little easier because we had a well established team. I just ended up, you know, fortunate enough to run it. Paramount was a little bit of a different story because it was not in its best years. The year before I got there, it lost $450 million, which is really an achievement, for a major studio, which can draw on its enormous heritage of existing movies being sold all over the world, generating hundreds of millions of dollars. So to lose that much means you had a really bad run. And they had had a really bad run for some time. So that required a much broader strategic and organizational change, which, I was able to implement. And one of the fortunate, in some ways, for the wrong reasons, but one of the fortunate opportunities was a lot of my former colleagues, or a number of my key former colleagues at Fox, were refugees from the purchase of Fox by Disney. So when Disney consolidated and, offered some people a right to stay and other people a buyout, some really talented colleagues and friends were available. And so I brought them in and we got the studio on a clear strategic track, rebuilt, some of the talent relationships and brought in some new ones and really trying to revitalize both the image and its place in the community. And, thanks to these great colleagues and the talented people, we had a really good run. And we built some new franchises like Sonic and A Quiet Place. And of course, then did the sequel to Top Gun Maverick, which is one of their biggest movies of all time. By the time I left 5 years later, we had a really good run, the best run in some years, and hit a profit of $400 million, which was nice to, there's a brag. That was an $850 million swing. So that was more of a rebuild, revitalization. Although the years at Fox were also, very successful. We had the biggest box office year of all time in 2014. So it takes some work. It takes a lot of really good people, and it takes direction and strategy, both internally and externally. You want to build on talent relations in a way that, throw money at talent anytime you want. It's not necessarily the smartest business move, but you want to be a place where talent feels comfortable bringing their work, bringing their projects, especially those that have multiple choices and can take it anywhere. You want talent to feel that their work will be respected, that they will be respected, that they will be properly supported, and that in the end, that you'll manage the marketing and distribution and presentation of their work in the right way. And they also want to know that you are people they want to work with, that they feel comfortable with. And that's not just, flying them around on private jets. That takes a genuine connection. So you work on that and you ensure that you have people who reflect that. So, and then you put all of that together with financial discipline, which is always key. I always reminded people, you got to remember, we're in the movie business. The movie part's really important, but so's the other part. And so we always tried, one of the things I promoted at both studios and throughout was, you want to be fiscally responsible so you can be creatively bold. And look, we had many of the trappings of major studios and fancy premieres and private planes, but to a much lesser extent, especially at Fox. And that was partly because of Rupert. He was not in for fancy pants Hollywood. And it became a sort of a strategic approach that we were not going to waste a lot of money on fluff and all of that stuff. We were going to put the money where the movies were and where the organization was, and ensure that, we were able to continue making broad, bold, creative bets, because we weren't losing our ass. So that was always a part of it.
You talked about Top Gun Maverick, and during your time at Fox, you oversaw some of the biggest box office hits of all time, including Titanic and Avatar. Looking back, so when you evaluated these projects, did you recognize them as obvious winners at the time, or were there calculated risks?
They were both. No, they were potentially massive winners, and they were risky. I mean, but at the heart of them, you know, James Cameron one of the greatest filmmakers of perhaps of all time, certainly one of the most successful. I've known Jim 30 years. I mean, I was a fan of his back before I knew him, with Terminator and Aliens. And I ended up working with him. That's when we started in 92 on Terminator 3. So here he comes. And then he had done True Lies. And so here he comes with, I'm going to make a movie about Titanic.
Mhm.
And, we said kind of, when you look at it objectively, you take Jim out of the factor, as a factor, and you go, well, wait a second, this has been made a few times. We know how it ends.
Mhm. And
Um,
it's not a happy ending.
and it's not a great ending. And Jim said, no, no, it's Romeo and Juliet on the boat. Oh, okay. Well, it's Jim Cameron, right? So I knew it had great global potential. I was actually running all the international at that point, and I was a big promoter of it and said we need to make this movie. But it was challenging because Jim does nothing in a
Mhm.
small way, which is one of the reasons he's so successful.
Yeah, you had to build a boat, right?
We built it almost to scale. We built a 900-foot ship in Baja California and a new tank, the biggest in the world at the time, in a studio that we actually built to be big enough to build a 900-foot set. And so it was nothing cheap about this. And obviously it's all on the screen. Jim, everything goes up on the screen, but it got very scary along the way because it was massively over budget. And the community here, was, oh, look what happens. Oh, what a huge disaster. Oh, this is awful. And then we started to see the material, and eventually Jim cut together, I forget what it was, 10 or 12 minutes. And it was just staggeringly genius. It was extraordinary. It's the most impressive thing you've ever seen on film. So we went, okay, maybe we'll be okay on this. Well, it ended up being by far, by double actually, the biggest box office movie of all time. Internationally, so it did 600 million here, and it was one of the first times that the industry saw the true potential of the international market because it did 600 million here and 1.2 billion outside the US. In fact, it was the number one movie for the first time in history, the number one movie in every country in the world, which had never happened before. So it was a huge, obviously huge success. But when we said let's do it, Leo DiCaprio, we had made Romeo and Juliet and kind of knew, oh, this is he's a talented young man. We had no idea he was going to be the biggest heartthrob on the planet. I arranged actually before the US release, Jim and I co-conspired on this to take the movie to the Tokyo Film Festival 6 weeks before the US opening. And by the way, our partner on the film was Paramount. So we only had international. So I was kind of the lead on that. And I said, well, you know what? This would be a big deal if, again, for the first time, a movie of this caliber opens outside the US for the first time. Well, Paramount wasn't too happy about it. And they weren't too happy about it, but we did it. I remember carrying the film, literally carrying the cans and putting them in the overhead bin, fly the movie to Tokyo. And that night in Tokyo, not the theater, not the streets around the theater, the entire neighborhood of Tokyo shut down to welcome Leo DiCaprio in this movie that they had now started to hear about, and all the anticipation built, and then it just took off, and so that was extraordinary. But no, in the beginning, there was trepidation, but there was always, especially not just for me, for many of us, there was a strong belief in Jim and his talent, and knowing that he would do something very unique. And when time came to Avatar, now I'm that chairman of the studio, and Jim had given me years before, just as a friend, he gave me a 12, 15 page, I forget, I have it somewhere here, short treatise of something called Project 880. And it was the story of avatars, basically, humans entering into alien capabilities in order to assimilate with local population and so forth. Seemed interesting. It was a thing. But then he brought it to us. And part of it was to be able to, it wasn't just like, this wasn't aliens in suits and prosthetics. This was being able to digitally superimpose an alien physiognomy and let the actor's performance bleed through, be apparent and be obvious and recognizable. And there's always been this thing in digital effects called the uncanny valley. And the uncanny valley refers to the fact that because we've imprinted on human faces as starting as in infancy, that somehow when you try and digitally create that, there's something always doesn't seem right. And so that was the biggest achievement of Avatar, but that wasn't cheap. And so we were faced with this huge budget and actually a huge budget. And basically, it was a story about 12-foot blue people with tails. In fact, he still teases me because I said, "Do we need tails? You have that tail?" Which is a typical stupid, I did it on purpose, but it was a typical stupid studio head kind of thing. I knew he's going to do what he was going to do, but we had to take the leap. And in the end, they were different voices, and we got a little nervous at one point, but I always believed. And I always believed because I believed in Jim. And, you know, I just believed in his talent and his ferocious capabilities as a creator. I mean, he just won't stop until it's right. It's one of the reasons sometimes it goes over budget, but I believed in him. And I also look, I think reductively, I was thinking, do you want to be the guy who took a chance on Jim Cameron after Titanic and maybe didn't go so good? Or do you want to be the guy who said no to Jim Cameron after Titanic? So when you really got down to that, I said, well, I'd rather be the guy who takes a chance on the guy who made the biggest movie of all time and is actually, I believe, one of the greatest directors. Anyway, so that's how Avatar came around. And once again, he hates it when I tell this story. So I hope he's not listening. But Rupert Murdoch called me and he said, "What's going on with this movie? This movie's way over budget. How much is it going to cost?" And I never lied to him ever, which is one of the reasons I managed to last almost 25 years. I said, "I don't know. I can tell you where it is now."
It's not a good answer.
I knew he wouldn't. I mean, but that was the honest answer because I didn't
Yeah.
know. He said, "Well, what are you talking about? You don't?" I said, "Well, no, but he's in the middle of it. And it's, well, is it going to be any good?" And I said, "No, it's going to be great." He said, "How do you know that?" I said, "Because he won't stop making it until it's great, which is why I can't tell you what it's going to cost." He said, "I never mind. Okay, hung up." But he was always supportive. And of course, it ballooned, but it didn't matter because the movie, $2.8 billion. And then we ended up greenlighting the sequels. But by then, I'd left and it sold to Disney, and now it's their privilege to do it. No one else can do what Jim does. I mean, even many of the greats, and there are greats, of course, but his embracing and his fluency in technology, I think, is unique, even with the greats like Spielberg and Scorsese and others. So, and Nolan, so many others. Anyway, so yeah, so it wasn't obvious, but you gotta back talent. You gotta take those risks with people that great.
It's interesting. You talked about movie business, the two sides of it. And James Cameron is focused on making the best movie he could. And part of that is being innovative and creating new technologies, not knowing what that's going to cost. So that's competing with the business side. And so I know you're thinking about the movie side, you're also thinking about the business side. And in order to get over the business side, you basically have to have a lot of faith that the movie's going to be unbelievable.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, Actually, one of the things I always said, the way I define the role of studio head, a lot of factors go into the movie choices, but I always felt that when you looked across, especially across her senior team, you wanted the production team, the people who are developing and going to be producing the movies, advocating the creative side of the company, to come to you believing fervently that this is going to be the greatest motion picture of all time. I just know it. It's going to be the greatest movie of all time. Then you want some other people on the finance side and on the business side of the studio to be part of that equation, just in case it's not the biggest movie of all time. And so you balance those two. You want both of those voices in the room, and but you need people who will fervently advocate, because otherwise, if they don't have passion about it, maybe it doesn't deserve to be on the table in front of you, you know, to make that ultimate decision, to spend 50 or 60 or 100 or $200 million of the company's money. So it is a balance of those. Yeah, it's the yin and yang of the business, what I call the movie business.
So when you look back, are you able to summarize the secrets to creating a successful movie? Are there recurring factors or principles you look for when greenlighting projects besides the creators being all in?
If I knew all the secrets of always being successful, I'd be unique in the history of the business. But there are
Yes.
factors. I mean, yeah, ultimately, you you it's a blend of a lot of inputs. The first and most important is always the story. What is this movie about? How is it unique? How is it original? Does it draw on pre-existing material? If it does, is it faithful to it, or does it have a unique and original take on it? Is it going to appeal to that audience? By the way, who is it for? Who are we making this movie for? Who is going to be the most responsive audience, the best demographically responsive, the psychographically responsive? How big is that audience? Is it, is it broadly, does it have a huge broad potential, or is it more targeted to a narrower demographic or a smaller portion of the audience? And does the budget match that? Is the budget appropriate to that potential size? What is ultimately, who are the creative elements? Are they well established? I mean, if it's Jim Cameron, we just talked about that. Are they well established, elements that you can rely on? Or are you taking a bet on some really great potential but unproven talent? And how do you factor that risk into the equation? In the end, also, how are you going to sell it? What are you going to tell people it's about? Now you've defined the audience, or you think you've defined the audience. Is it what we call a pre-awareness title, something that they'll know about and expect? Or is it something completely unique? And if it is, how are you going to convey it? How easy is it to get that marketing message across and to define the film for people that have never heard of it? So all of those factors go into the mix. And you don't make that in a vacuum. You don't make that decision in a vacuum. Ultimately, as the studio head, you're the final word on that. But you bring in obviously the creative team, the advocates, those passionate advocates. You bring in the marketing team. How are you guys going to sell this? How do you feel about this? How does it compare to other films that have worked? The international folks, how are you going to sell this around the world? Will it resonate around the world, or will it seem too, US centric, or culturally unrelatable or less relatable? What do the downstream media think is the potential for it? At least back in the day when we had multiple downstream media, now it's a different game. But you bring all these people together and you get their input. And if you have the right people, they feel comfortable giving their honest and forthright opinion. And you then listen to all those factors, and then you go to the other part I talked about, which is you do a P&L. And the beauty of being in the industry, having consistency across years of experience as a studio or any big producer, is that you have metrics that are fairly consistent. If it does this at the box office, it's going to do this downstream, or it's going to cost this or that. And so you have models. And so you look across a range and you say, okay, if it does 40 million, it's this. And if it does 80 million, it's or 100 million, whatever, it's that. I never looked very far on the right because once you're in profit, that's great. But you kind of look at what are the likely downside and upside possibilities. And you say, okay, well, here's that band, and that range is our risk or our opportunity. And then sometimes you'll say, okay, we'll do this, but as we did at Fox, but we want a partner. Or not just another studio. Sometimes you'll bring in other people's money and lay off a portion of the cost of the movie with an equity partner for 25% or 30 something percent, sometimes half. Obviously, give up some of your upside, but it's a balancing of risk. So a lot of it is that initial evaluation of those key factors, really starting with story and who's making it and what's it about. And then saying, okay, what's the risk profile? And sometimes at a studio, I don't want to belabor this issue, but at a studio, when you're looking across a slate, when we made Life of Pi, that was a very expensive movie because it was, a digital tiger. Was a lot of special effects, massive special effects. In fact, one director said, "No, I think I can do it, practical." So, what do you mean? With a tiger and a kid? And I looked at him and I said, "Well, you're going to need more than one kid." So we ended up. So, but why? That movie it was of course Oscar bait. We knew that. And we also knew that was really, really risky. But that year we had an Ice Age movie, which was the closest thing to a layup, and an X-Men movie. And so we looked at the rest of the slate and we said, well, okay, we're in really good shape here with these movies. If this one tanks making a really bold, creative risk on a brilliant filmmaker, okay, we'll be okay. So that's the one other factor. Doesn't usually play into it, but where you have strength across your slate, you feel you could take some creative risk in other parts of it.
Well, what's interesting about what you just described is most of this analysis, I assume, is done before the movie's even made in any part.
It's before you spend the dollar.
All
Well,
right.
you typically, and that's another thing that it's an old trick in Hollywood where before you actually green light the movie and say, okay, good, here's 100 million, go make it. You're spending money developing scripts. They'll come to you and say, we want to book the sets because you may not decide to make it, but if you do decide to make it, we got to make sure we've got these sets because you're going to start in, February and they're going to get this. And what you try and avoid is that there's too much sunk money by the time you have to make the full decision. It's an old, you learn these tricks over the years. But yes, all of this happens for the most part other than the development money before you make the big bet, of course.
So there's a lot of execution risk on top of everything that you described.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. A lot of execution risk, which goes back to who are you making the movie with, how confident, and then, who are the people surrounding them? Who's the line producer? Who are the producers? Are they capable of managing the project? Because, I always thought about, I don't know, maybe a dumb comparison, but I always thought making a movie is kind of like funding Columbus. So you get to argue with Columbus about how much salted pork he's going to get and how much barrels of this he's going to get and all of that. And you have all that conversation. But at some point, he throws the lines off and sails off, and you hope he comes back with spices and doesn't get into a hurricane. So you only have so much control once the movie starts. Obviously, you're constantly on set. You're constantly, personally, you have people that are constantly monitoring, the production and managing it financially and accounting department, but there's a limit to how much you can control, how many takes a director does, whether there are directional changes that happen during the film, normal human stuff. Actors get sick or actors get hurt or things happen. Rains when it shouldn't, it doesn't rain when it should, things like that. There's always some.
And you talked about sunk costs, and I'm sure you hit a point of no return at some level as well.
Oh yeah, because you could stop now and have half a movie. What are you going to do with that? Yeah, oh, that's definitely that's the part of the line cast off. You got to make sure. I hope that ship comes back, but you don't you don't can't do much with half a movie. And starting over or firing directors, unfortunately, never had to do that. But that's even more costly. So yeah, you can get into some trouble, and it happens. It happens at every studio and throughout the history of the industry. And sometimes you have to make on Top Gun. We did very substantial reshoots. And Tom Cruise had said to me at the beginning, okay, we're going to do this, Jim, but we're going to do it until it's right. I said, of course, Tom. And after I heard that, I thought, I wonder what he means by that. And then he said, we need more aerial sequences. I don't feel like those sequences are enough or right. And we need to do this. And we really need to reshoot this scene. And it was not an insubstantial amount of money toward the end of the movie, but the talent involved in both on the directing side, but also Tom as a very, very active creative element of that movie had already shown us. I mean, what we had seen was phenomenal. And so we had to take it to the next level, and we did. And it was worth it. And it paid off over multiple times. But so even sometimes with a film that's disciplined and on budget, or at least close to budget, it sometimes makes sense to make a little extra investment to get it to the right place.
I think that movie in particular surprised a lot of people because it was decades, after the original. You would think who's gonna, release a second decades later, but it just came together so remarkably well.
Yeah. In fact, the interesting thing was I was at Paramount for the first one. I was working at Paramount, running all of the video and pay television and a bunch of other stuff and international, all that stuff. Anyway, when when we did the first Top Gun, and so I had the experience twice, but I mean on different levels.
So you talked about the history of the industry, but would you help us understand the evolution of the film industry over the past several decades and where you believe it's headed?
Oh boy. Well, yeah. First, I actually taught a course at USC just for the fun of it, but that ended up being a lot about this. And part of it is when you look across the history of the industry, there are three core elements that have defined it throughout time. The first, of course, is the creators and the creative, aspect, the content. The second is the technology and how that enables those creators to create and to manifest their creation, and also how that content is ultimately experienced and seen. And the third element is the audience and how the audience has what options and choices the audience has about what they see, how they see it, where they see it, and how they decide what they want to see. And when you look at those three, you can make all kinds of Venn diagrams, but they're always in constant motion. And they're all kind of, I think they're equally important, but technology is often at the center of it all, right? So
It connects the two, right? In
yeah,
some ways.
it defines both of them, yes. And but you couldn't, all the tech in the world is useless if you don't have a Steven Spielberg or a Jim Cameron or any great director. So yeah, but technology does sort of define it. So when you look at the evolution, it's just a series of disruptions, right? So You started with silent movies and just the fact that the picture moved was enough. And then you had sound and then sound. And by the way, the one thing that I found throughout the evolution of, and I know we're back more than decades. One thing I found is that not atypically, the incumbents at the time of disruption resisted the disruption. That's not surprising. Jack Warner famously said, "Who the hell wants to hear actors talk?" So in television, so then you had, the evolution of theater going, and people were going to the movies a number of times a week because that's how you knew what was going on in the Second World War. Because of newsreels, and you got a cartoon, and you got away and got out of the depression and found a way to escape, from difficult times in history. So along comes television, and holy shit, this is the end of civilization. This is going to destroy us. In fact, I came across this thing. MGM in the beginning of the late 40s and 50s, when television came, prohibited any filmmaker from showing a television set in a living room. They wanted to kill this thing in the crib. It's a crib. They wanted to stop this medium as quickly as possible. And so there was a point when, all the studios were on the verge of bankruptcy. People stopped going to the movies. They stayed home, watched Milton Berle. And, the studios didn't know what to do until one of them woke up and so some of them woke up and said, well, wait a second, these guys they show things, right? We got things. We have all these movies that have only once been shown in a theater. You think they want to buy? All of a sudden there's a gold rush. And then they thought, well, wait a second. These guys tell stories on these little television sets. We know how to tell stories. Why don't we make them? Gold rush. Same thing again with video. Oh, video is going to kill everything. Turned into multi-hundreds of billions of dollars. And then, of course, the internet. And the internet came pretty close to being destructive for a while. And there were many of us, and I was in the thick of it, going up and having big fights with Google because they were just everybody was just pirating, building these platforms. Not so much Google, but in a way they were with YouTube. They were just grabbing anything they could do and put it up on the platform and then apologizing later. And they were driving us a little crazy. And for the first time, you didn't have to go to some flea market to buy a cassette of the movie. You just put on the internet and you could have anything you wanted. And any kid who stole a copy of the movie or copied it in a movie theater, put it up in the entire planet. Holy shit, this is the end. And of course, we saw what happened. And so that all evolved. And I think the biggest change has been the devolution of linear television and multi-channel television. The legacy studios have had an absolute bonanza in cable television for a long time. Anyone, and most of them did, who had a core must-have network could multiply that with a number of other ancillary networks and get paid for 105 million cable households in the US. Well, that 105 is now, and last time I looked, it's 60 and headed south of 50. So when you look at the decrease of massive flow of revenue that disappeared from the legacy media companies, they're scrambling to try and figure out how to replace it. And then here comes the latest disruptors. My very good friend Ted Sarandos, one of the smartest, by far, I think, one of the smartest people in the industry. In fact, in the recent history of the industry, just swallowed Warner Brothers. We'll see how it plays out. But he was stuffing envelopes 30 years ago. And then through genius and innovation and disruption and boldness, went online and said, here, no ads, all the series at once. We're going to go spend, I forget what he spent on House of Lies, House of Lies, that's House of the first show he did. All of a sudden, you had this really bold disruptor who created this platform that was completely unique, different from anything people had ever seen before. A subscription available on the internet with great technology to support it, compression technology, which became like instantly overnight. Wow, this is great. To the point where obviously it attracted competitors. Amazon came in and said, we're not going to let that be the only guy, let them be the only guys in town. So they jumped in and then others jumped in. And so the business transformed, but they built their businesses. And when the industry looks back, they all know it now. But those platforms, particularly Amazon and especially Netflix, built those platforms on the back of pre-existing content from the legacy studios. And the legacy studio, we were one of the last to take some comfort in that, not much. We were one of the last to aggressively license Netflix. But after a while, the money was so great, you couldn't say no. So all the legacy studios opened up their vaults and licensed a massive amount of their content, and in the process made hundreds of millions of dollars, many millions of dollars. Yeah, hundreds. Then they woke up and said, oh, what did we do? We just created a monster. We created our competition. Let's pull back and we'll build our own. Right. And by the way, we better build it fast because over on the cable side of the company, that ice cube is melting as fast as it can. So now I need to replace the financial equivalent of over 50 million households paying subscription fees for my cable networks with the streamer I started yesterday. And the streamers at this point are very healthy, many, many hundreds of millions of tens of millions in case of Netflix, now 300 million, but even then, 150, 200 million subscribers paying $10 a month. Pretty soon you got a good war chest. They don't need the studio's original content, existing content. They just go full bore into original content. So now there's a content arms race by the existing platforms, the existing streaming platforms, and then the legacy players who came in late and are desperate to catch up, fighting this battle of how can we keep up with the deep pockets. It's not just, by the way, it's not just the number of subscribers that Prime and Netflix and even HBO. Of course, Disney had was a great competitor, different than some of the other legacy, a little further along. But they're desperately trying to catch up to these streamers built and run by tech companies who not only have a war chest based on their subscribers, but they're worth ridiculous amounts of money. So anytime they want to fund that arms race, so you can see why the industry has shifted to where the tech guys were welcome visitors in terms of their largesse and their licensing and who are in the business of, you know what, we don't want to be in this nasty business of taking chances, dealing with all these creators are all a pain in the ass. We'll just license the stuff to now being full bore in it. And so the ground under Hollywood has been shifting now for the better part of a decade, but even just in the past few years, it's gotten shaky. And these companies are facing, understandably, very stiff competition from the folks up north who are very much in the Hollywood, very much part of the community now. So, that's been the evolution. And it's hard. It's hard to keep up that arms race. I think Paramount's, when we launched Paramount Plus, we were one of the last people in. It was tough. We had a massive amount of content, but like zero subscribers. So, trying to play in that game and say, okay, well, we're going to allocate so much money to make content. We're going to forward price this or invest in this was very challenging and has been very challenging. So that's what you're seeing now. And that's one of the reasons why you're seeing so much consolidation in the legacy business of Disney taking over Fox. And now what was going to be Paramount, but ended up being Netflix, buying Warner Brothers because there was a limit to how well they could sustain, how well they could replace the economics of their pre-existing legacy live action business, a linear business with streaming. You couldn't build it quickly enough to manage it. And so, and there are other reasons. I think obviously the debt that Warner took on, but so that's what's happened. And I think that it's become sort of I wouldn't say there may be an existential threat to Hollywood. That may come later in different form. But in terms of the legacy studios, they have been in a very challenged position. The only exception, or the main exception, is Disney. And of course, Universal has a very wealthy and successful and supportive parent, and as well, Universal has been on a great tear creatively, really well run business with Donna Langley. But all of these other businesses, when television challenged theatrical and video challenged theatrical and the internet challenged everything, they were all not just accretive, they were massively additive to the pre-existing businesses. Streaming has not been that, at least for the existing business. It has not replaced the business. It has not replaced the economics of the business that it put away, which was mainly linear television.
And how does artificial intelligence factor into all of this in terms of the evolution and where things are headed?
I don't think there's a single place that it won't find its way. We're not talking about super intelligence. We're talking about AGI and the capabilities but even that is very substantial. You look at Sora is, a perfectly capable technology able to replicate. It's still, not quite there yet, but the speed of its evolution, of the evolution of AI to be able to create acceptable video imagery is basically here and is only going to get bigger or better. So that's shaking the foundations. And, it really falls into two kinds of categories. One is that there's a fear that it will replace the traditional form of filmmaking where, somebody starts with a blank sheet of paper and writes a script and then figures out how to get it financed and then goes and puts all the pieces together and films it and does all of that and eventually puts it in theaters or on a streamer and all of that to a machine that does all of that. I think we're still a long way from there. What it will do, however, and it's risk and real risk of a lot of really great, hardworking people in the community is a very substantial displacement of many of the routine, and I don't mean lacking in talent, but routine functions. Editing, post production, special effects, animation. Animation is probably in many ways, might be the first to go. Animated films, several hundred animators to make one of these full length, Pixar, Disney, or any great animated film. I mean, a lot of those jobs are going to be displaced throughout the production food chain. Many of those tasks will be AI replaced. And that's really sad and really threatening at a time when the industry is already reeling from COVID and from the strikes, which in part were meant to avoid the impact I just described and did so to a degree, but couldn't do it completely. So that's the bad news. The bad news is it is going to replace and displace a lot of good paying, many cases just, good, solid, middle class, upper middle class union jobs that have supported a broad variety of hardworking, good people. And that's that. It's probably here or coming soon.
If you go back to the three components, yeah, the creatives, the technology, and the audience.
Right.
So the technology is expanding and it's bleeding into the creative side.
Exactly. Exactly. Now, once again, it's when digital became a tool that filmmakers could use because the technology was there. All of a sudden, a director, a filmmaker, had the ability to do things in a more efficient way. Or when special effects, when technology, provided the means to do special effects, you had Jurassic Park, right? So the past, it enabled filmmakers, and it will do that again because there is the other side. And the other side of it is that right now, one of the areas, and talk about the evolution of the business, one of the areas that's most challenged is the theatrical experience. Right now, the movie theater going is about 70% of what it was before COVID. People got out of the habit of COVID. Streaming was there. They couldn't go out, they couldn't do anything, maybe buy a little bigger TV, subscribe to Netflix, and you're good to go. Why go to the movies unless it's Avatar, unless it's Wicked, unless it's some huge movie? So the theatrical experience is challenged and the theatrical infrastructure is challenged. At the same time, the people willing to take the bet to make, I pick any movie other than, that's why you see so many sequels. Because if you're going to spend 150, $200 million making a movie, you're not as likely to do it on something no one's ever heard of and find out you just lost 100 or even 200. Because by the time you do all the marketing, you could lose the whole thing. So what that's going to do is erode the originality, or has the potential to erode the originality and creativity. So what you'll end up seeing is just an endless number of the same remake sequels.
And that has a negative feedback.
Well, yeah, because people get tired of that. Nah,
Yeah.
I saw three, or I saw five. I'm not going to see seven, right? So, yeah, people get tired of it, and who cares? So, one of the advantages, and again, to some extent, it comes at the price of hurting hardworking folks in the business, is the efficiencies of it. A filmmaker and a studio can sit together and see the entire film and previs in AI, right? I mean, these tools are now at a place where, and they will be at a place where you can envision the entire film with real credible looking actors. Of course, you got to go make it. It's not the AI making the film. You probably end up shooting it, but you have a better sense of where it's working, how it's working. You'll use it as a tool to enhance your marketing. It'll be more efficient in, editing, post-production, special effects. So is there a time when these tools are so efficient and so enable creators that you can have a really smart, capable filmmaker who would be who would need $150 million today to make that movie that no studio would finance because see above, it's not a sequel or an obvious thing. But comes back and says, I can make that now for 40 or 30 or 50 or whatever it is. So do those efficiencies eventually, when you take the full benefit of the curve, evolution of the curve, do those efficiencies then lead to a different loop where more movies that wouldn't otherwise have been made get made, more creative and original choices get made, which wouldn't be made because of the enableability and being enabled by these technologies and especially with AI. So there is that possibility. And the likelihood, actually, I would believe that at at some point these technologies always in the hands of a human being. That's the whole thing that I think needs to be really carefully considered, which is I don't think a machine, I have a lot of experience with the tech people and with Silicon Valley and all those folks, and a great deal of respect for them. Some of these AI folks, I'm still waiting. I'm still a little leery of some of the things that I'm hearing and concerned about, especially with super intelligence. But the ability for some of these machines is ultimately limited by the fact that it really takes a human being to convey empathy and happiness and sadness and emotions and infuse a film and infuse a storytelling with those emotions and sensibilities. So ultimately, at the top, at the origin, not just legally, because your copyright needs a human being. The guilds will hopefully even end up putting even more corrals around artificial contributions to creative output. But at the end, you have human creativity enabled or supported by AI. And then the key is, where does the balance end up? If someone was writing a film or making a film about the French Revolution, in the old days, they would go down in the basement of Paramount Pictures and it'd be this massive library of books and magazines and lithographs and all of this stuff to understand what would Paris have looked like the end, at the time of the revolution. Well, now, and then Google came along. Well, that was enabling. You could go look it up, right? With AI, you can see it. Now, that's not bad. That's actually good. That's an enabling tool. I'm just giving one silly example, but that is an example of ways that this enables the creator to decide what direction or how to build a set, or how it should look, or how this particular character would be dressed in ways that are just more facile. But again, along the way, set designers, production designers, costumers, it's going to replace some of those tasks. But ultimately, I think the creative process will always be with humans, or it needs to be with humans. And then we have to figure out how to make the most of this without wrecking the entire industry in the process.
Throughout your career, you've supported a closer relationship between Hollywood and Silicon Valley. You've been doing that for a long time. Why did you prioritize that connection?
Pretty obvious that these guys, they weren't going away. And certainly at the time of the internet, they were here. And, it started with, as I mentioned, it started with trying to keep the piracy at bay. So we did that. And eventually it evolved and we saw, pirated music sites, become very successful subscription sites on the internet. So we were hoping and watching for that evolution to move from just taking all the stuff for free to business models that worked. And that's how I ended up getting to know and ended up being very close with Steve Jobs, the launch of iTunes. And Steve at first, spent a lot of time telling me what an idiot I and all the rest of us were. And then we started talking about stuff and try to find the way. How do we put movies on iTunes at a price that was well below what you could buy a DVD, but how it made sense? Obviously you didn't have a lot of the cost. Anyway, there's a lot of details to that. But at first it was end the fear, and then it was seize the opportunity. And in order to do that, you really, these companies weren't going away. Google wasn't going to shut down YouTube. Steve wasn't going to stop in his mission to redefine the way we experience just about everything. That was truly a privilege to hear him talk about stuff. But yeah, it was a chance to say, okay, wow, what this thing is it's not unlike AI. At first, it was a huge threat. Oh, you mean anybody can see the movie the guy posted? Oh shit, that's bad. To, oh, anybody could see the movie and also buy the movie. I mean, streaming wouldn't exist without the internet, and a lot of especially few smart people like Ted Sarandos, as I mentioned. And Steve was at the was at the heart of it all. The ability, the first time, we came out of a meeting. It was crazy. He came out of a meeting about iTunes, about putting movies then on his platform and on the iPod. And so we battered back and forth. And I said, I'll we're at Fox. I said, I'll walk you to your car. And he said, oh, great. Thank you. Okay. We started walking down the hall. And he said, want to see something cool? And he pulled out the prototype of the iPhone and he starts flipping record covers. And he said, want to make a phone call? Watch this.
Do you remember what year that was?
It was it 10?
Okay.
2010? Something. I think that's about right. It's right it was just before, it was whatever year it was that we gave the first movies to iTunes. Well, but I don't know. It was very, very shortly, not very long before the iPhone. So you look at this and you go, okay, first, these guys are here to stay. Second, the threat can become an opportunity. And if inevitably they are going to be at the heart of, or a very important part of the ecosystem by which people will experience our content. So how do you not, work with them, fight them when you have to, but work with them? Right now, YouTube went from stealing all our stuff to eventually we figured out a way to see some money out of it to right now, it is the most watched medium in the industry. More people watch YouTube than Netflix. Forget the networks are ancient history, the dinosaurs now. So you watch this evolution and you look at these technologies and you go, okay, well, this is going to both enable new business models, new opportunities, new ways to disperse our stuff. So pirate music site becomes Spotify. The record companies who were really on their ass all of a sudden overnight are flush. Why? Because they monetize not just their new stuff, but their entire history of music. So you look at those technologies and you say, well, that's what it's capable of. Let's go figure out how to do more of that. So it wasn't genius. It was kind of obvious.
And I guess it all goes back to those three components, right? There's
Yeah.
the creative, the technology, and the
Yeah.
audience. And there's
The
different ways
audience,
to distribute.
exactly. The audience wasn't going to buy. I remember going into a Virgin Megastore and seeing side by side a I think it was a Lord of the Rings DVD, which was 14.99, and next to it a CD of Bozo and the Whoever's. Wasn't a big band, and I'm noted because of what for $13. I'm thinking that's a $200 million budget movie that made $1 billion. And that's a band no one's ever heard of. How long is it going to take the dumbest music lover to say, that's not fair? I'm not doing that. So Steve said 99 cents. If there's one song from those bozos you like, you can have it. So eventually, you know, it wasn't just the manner in which audiences experienced content, but it was the business models which just seemed more reasonable to them. And so what you're seeing now is now that the streamers have acclimated people to how cool and how good the stuff is. Every few months or every 6 months, every year, another dollar. When Bob Iger launched Disney Plus at $6.99, I said, I know what we're going to do. This is boiling the frog. You get everybody in at $6.99. No one with a kid under 10 is not going to subscribe. Sure enough, they did. And then the service was so good that another dollar here or there, it's okay, fine. And then, of course, they enhanced their streaming in an interesting way. Well, it's not that interesting. It's pretty obvious. In an interesting way, the disruptor streaming, which said, strip out all the ads. You can just have this subscription service. You don't need to subscribe to cable and have a lot of networks that you never watch. Just come here and you don't have to see any ads. Has now evolved to where, well, you can pay a lot of money or more money and not have ads, or you can pay less money and have ads. Oh, and by the way, if you come here, and it's happening increasingly, if you come to Prime Video, we'll give you this service, and that service for this one price with ads. So, how all overnight, everybody who was complaining about the nature of cable, it's actually being replicated in the bundling of streaming services. So, if you want to pay more money, and once again, those are the audience choices. If you want to pay more money, you don't have to see any ads or have any other service. But if you want more at a lower price, we can give that to you. It's called bundling. And now it actually looks like cable on the internet. It's really what it is.
You made 2 points that to me stand out. One is the industry has continued to evolve over time. You talked about silent movies and video and internet and so on. And the other point that you made that stands out is the incumbents tend to be slow to evolve. How can legacy studios successfully embrace innovation and technology like AI without losing sight of their core value of storytelling?
I think what you have to do, and what I always tried to do, and others that I had emulated or benefited from, was to embrace the technologies, was to understand that, you know, they're not going away. So I think it's important to embrace the technologies, to find ways to work with them and take the benefit of their efficacy and their benefits. And at the same time, be very mindful of talking now about current studios, the legacy studios. Tech guys aren't going away. You'll still have to compete with them. In terms of technology, embrace it, take advantage of its utility, always continue to look to the great storytellers and the great filmmakers and the great creative voices, writers and just, directors and talent on screen, in front of the camera, behind the camera. Always look to those humans because they're the ones who are going to make the most acceptable and successful and valuable entertainment experience. And then utilize the tech, but figure out how to put guardrails, have some self-discipline about the manner in which you approach it. Support legislation that prevents deep fakes, which is happening in the industry. Work with the guilds. There's always been an antagonistic relationship, or at least an adversarial at times relationship with the guilds, usually about money. At this point, it's okay, we have to join together to make sure that these things don't get out of hand.
You're on the same team.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's being mindful of the technologies they don't disappear. I mean, if they're bad, they disappear, but some of these technologies aren't going anywhere. So figure out how to use them effectively and always be respectful of the human element.
And I suppose in some ways it's like a compromise, right? You accept the
Yeah.
things that are great, and then you compromise some areas, and you don't give up on others, and that's how you move forward.
You have a lot of talented people at risk of being displaced. Figure out how to convert them to people who can utilize these technology tools so that you have the benefit of their expertise and their talent. And also, frankly, you know, you avoid having to lay off or fire a whole lot of people. Figure out how to take advantage of people who have been making movies and television successfully, making content successfully for a long time, repurpose them, help them, give them these tools and provide them with opportunities to utilize them. Now, you may not need as many of them. That's just maybe a sad reality, but at least don't displace everyone overnight when you can have them be an adjunct to an efficient technology.
Yeah, I'm sure there's tremendous value and insight in their experience that is
Exactly.
hard to just replace by a computer.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's an important element, I think.
The last question I'm going to ask you is about your legacy. How do you hope your legacy will be in Hollywood? And what advice would you share with the next generation of studio leaders?
I would like to think that I treated people with respect, both inside the companies that I worked for and the ones that I ran, and externally, that I made a contribution to the industry, that both in promoting its talent and its art, I made some good decisions along the way and can be hopefully forgiven for the ones that didn't work.
A few decent movies.
Pretty decent movies, and let's forget about some of those others. It seemed like a good idea at the time. And that I did so with gratitude and maybe some measure of grace. And yeah, that I was good, at least decent at what I did, and that I left the mark, and I left something behind. I think for future leaders, recognize, as I think I did, I felt it, that you're privileged to hold a unique position. This is an incredible opportunity to run a studio. But it also comes with an obligation, to the past and an obligation to the future. For the studio that you lead, you're the custodian of its heritage. So respect that, and yeah, it comes with all kinds of privileges and you probably make a bunch of money, but respect the fact that you're in a very privileged position, and also respect the fact that you're called the chairman because you're sitting in the chair. Someone sat there before you, and someone's going to sit there after you. So don't take yourself so seriously. And ultimately, make great shit and don't be an asshole. Pretty
Very simple advice. And I guess don't forget the 10-year-old in you that's in awe of the theater and the movies.
I
That's
still remember some of them, including the ones I had zero business watching. Anyway, that's it.
Jim, this has been great. I appreciate you sharing all your experience and insights with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please visit our website at insightfulinvestor.org to access past shows and learn more about our podcast. If you have questions, feel free to email us at info@insightfulinvestor.org. And if you enjoyed the discussion, please subscribe to this podcast to ensure you don't miss future episodes. And don't forget to forward today's conversation to others you think would enjoy listening. Important information. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, tax, investment, or business advice. It is not a solicitation, recommendation, or endorsement. All opinions expressed by participants are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Evoke Advisors Division of MAI Capital Management, LLC, or Evoke, its affiliates, or any companies mentioned. Information shared has not been independently verified by MAI or its affiliates. MAI Capital Management, LLC, or MAI, is registered with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, which does not imply any particular level of skill or training. Certain information contained herein has been obtained from third-party sources, and such information has not been independently verified. No representation, warranty, or undertaking, expressed or implied, is given to the accuracy or completeness of such information by any person. While such resources are believed to be reliable, Evoke does not assume any responsibility for the accuracy or completeness of such information. Evoke does not undertake any obligation to update the information contained herein as of any future date. The content is intended for a general audience and does not constitute a recommendation to buy or sell securities or adopt any investment strategy. Any examples or scenarios discussed are illustrative only, involve risks and uncertainties, and do not guarantee future results. Non-traditional assets carry significant risks and may not be suitable for all investors. Decisions should be based on individual objectives, risk tolerance, and circumstances. Statements herein are general and may not reflect an individual's or entity's specific circumstances or applicable laws, which vary by jurisdiction. Further, speakers' views are personal and may differ from Evoke and MAI recommendations and are not specific investment advice, and do not consider client objectives, risk tolerance, and diversification. Guests may have current or past relationships with Evoke and MAI, its affiliates, or the host, including as clients, service providers, or business partners. Participation does not constitute an endorsement or testimonial. No compensation has been paid or received for guest participation unless disclosed. MAI and its affiliates may have business relationships with entities mentioned in this podcast, which could create potential conflicts of interest. These relationships may include advisory services, investment management, or other arrangements. MAI seeks to manage such conflicts consistent with its fiduciary obligations and policies.